Hello, this is Chris Wilhelm, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Friday, February 20th issue of the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In 2025, trade deficit in goods reached record high. Data released Thursday by the Census Bureau showed the overall trade deficit with the world narrowed, the result of an expanding trade surplus in services. The trade deficit in goods was the highest on record. By Ben Castleman and Anna Swanson. President Trump has repeatedly promised that his steep tariffs would reduce U.S. imports, shrink the trade deficit, and lead to a revival in American manufacturing. So far, the opposite has occurred. U.S. imports grew last year, and the trade deficit in goods hit a record high, data released Thursday showed, as Mr. Trump's policies scrambled trade but did not halt it. That was consistent with other data suggesting that companies have rerouted orders and revamped supply chains to skirt tariffs, but have not, so far, brought production back to the United States en masse. American manufacturers have cut more than 80,000 jobs in the past year. High tariffs and unpredictable policy drove huge swings in trade last year. Companies stockpiled products ahead of tariffs going into effect, then halted imports. American investors bought and sold large quantities of foreign gold as a hedge against volatile markets. But although hefty tariffs dampened purchases of imported cars, household consumer items, and other goods somewhat, America's trade with the world remained relatively robust. The United States imported chips to fill new artificial intelligence data centers, and Americans snapped up foreign weight loss drugs, all helping to buoy cross-border trade. The total trade deficit, including trade in both goods and services, shrank slightly last year, as growth in exports narrowly outpaced growth in imports. But that was entirely the result of an expanding trade surplus in services. The trade deficit in physical goods, which has been Mr. Trump's focus as he has sought to use tariffs to restore U.S. manufacturing sector, actually grew in 2025. Overall imports of goods and services increased 4.7% to $4.3 trillion in 2025, while exports rose 6.2% to $3.4 trillion. The trade deficit, the amount by which imports exceed exports, was $901 billion, down from $903 billion in 2024. The trade deficit grew sharply at the end of the year, rising 32.6% in December as imports rose and exports fell. Tariffs did lead the drastic shift in the countries with which the United States trades. Imports of goods from China tumbled nearly 30% to their lowest level since 2009 as companies turned to factories in other parts of the world. But U.S. exports to China fell by nearly as much as the country, unlike many other U.S. trade partners, retaliated against Trump's policies. The goods trade deficit with China shrank to $202 billion in 2025, the smallest in more than 2 decades, and for the first time on record, smaller than the deficit with the European Union. But as Americans bought less from China, they bought more from the rest of the world. Trade deficits with Vietnam, Mexico, India, and other countries were the largest on record. The data has raised questions about whether Mr. Trump's trade policy is restructuring the United States to be less dependent on imports or mostly shuffling trade around. Mr. Trump has said steep tariffs and new trade deals will boost American factory production, making the country less dependent on foreign goods. Many importers have responded to tariffs and the threat of them by adjusting the timing of deliveries and the countries from which they purchase at great cost and inconvenience. Tariffs have also pushed up prices for American consumers, although by less than some economists initially feared. A study this month from economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York found that American businesses and consumers have borne most of the cost of the tariffs. U.S. exporters, particularly farmers, have also been caught in the crossfire of Mr. Trump's trade wars. U.S. soybean exports fell sharply last year as China boycotted that crop and bought instead from Brazil and other countries as retaliation for Mr. Trump's tariffs. American soybean farmers exported only $17.5 billion of their product in 2025, down from $25.8 billion in 2024. China stopped buying American farm products for most of last year until U.S. and Chinese officials agreed to a trade truce in late October. As part of that agreement, China pledged to buy 12 million metric tons of soybeans last year and 25 million metric tons in each of the next 3 years. The 25 million metric tons is in line with what China has bought in recent years. To help farmers deal with the fallout of the trade war, the Trump administration provided them with $12 billion in federal aid. But whether the policies lead to lower imports, higher exports, and a narrower trade deficit in the long run still appears something of an open question. Bernard Yaros, the lead economist at Oxford Economics, said it was a bit too early to tell what the lasting impacts of Trump's trade policies are. He said U.S. imports were now hovering below their trend from the decade before Mr. Trump's second term. Part of that was payback for the huge spike in imports at the start of last year, and part was the impact of tariffs on the relative price of imports rising. We still need to see where imports settle once the inventory effect from massive stockpiling in early 2025 wears off, he added. After Mr. Trump's election, companies had rushed to bring goods into the country before tariffs took effect, causing imports and the trade deficit to soar. Imports began to fall back after Mr. Trump announced global tariffs in April, including draconian levies on China. The president temporarily paused most of those tariffs to allow for trade negotiations, but reimposed them at lower levels in August. As of January 19th, U.S. consumers faced an overall average tariff rate of 16.9%, the highest since 1932, according to calculations by the Yale Budget Lab. The trade deficit briefly plunged in October, falling to the lowest monthly figure since June 2009. But much of that drop appeared to be the result of temporary fluctuations in trade, particularly in gold. The trade deficit rebounded somewhat in November before growing further in December. The president has long seen trade deficits as a sign of a weak U.S. economy and argued that high tariffs would encourage more U.S. factory production and cause the trade deficit to fall. Many economists disagree with the single-minded focus on the metric, saying that the trade deficit can fall for many reasons, not all of them good. The tariffs have also shuffled U.S. trade with various countries. In particular, the trade deficit with China has shrunk as companies rejiggered their supply chains in anticipation of higher tariffs on the country. But Brad Setser, an economist at the Council on Foreign Relations, said that American tariffs on Chinese exports had not ended up being that much higher than tariffs on goods from other parts of Asia, raising the question of whether companies would continue moving supply chains out of China. Mr. Setser said that the United States had also simply started importing more from elsewhere in Asia. The drop in the U.S. trade deficit with China was mostly offset by a big rise in the U.S. trade deficit with Vietnam, other countries in Southeast Asia, India, and Taiwan last year. In some cases, shipments to the United States from elsewhere in Asia have still come from Chinese companies. Chinese firms have set up new factories outside of China to be able to export to the United States without paying the higher tariffs. China's trade statistics show that while its trade surplus with the United States has fallen, its trade surplus with the rest of the world has soared, Mr. Setser said. The administration is trying to get far too much credit for shifting imports around a bit and moving to a world where Chinese content comes to the U.S. on a one-stop flight rather than a non-stop, he said. The goods coming through Southeast Asia have enormously significant amounts of Chinese content. Trade from Asia remains strong in part because Mr. Trump chose to exempt electronics from his tariffs last year. The region continued to provide Americans with tax-free electronics, as well as semiconductors and other equipment necessary for data centers. The administration also did not end up putting meaningful tariffs on foreign pharmaceuticals, and imports of drugs helped to push up the trade deficit. Tariffs could undergo more changes in the weeks to come. The Supreme Court is expected to rule, potentially as soon as Friday, on the legality of many of the tariffs that Mr. Trump issued using a 1970s emergency law. Trump officials have said that if those tariffs were struck down, they would use other authorities to impose new duties to replace them. Uber moves to enact stricter background checks for drivers. The New York Times revealed in December that the ride-hailing giant approved drivers with many types of criminal convictions, including violent felonies. By Emily Steele. Uber is taking steps to enact stricter background checks after a New York Times investigation in December revealed that the ride-hailing giant's policies allowed for drivers with many types of criminal convictions, including violent felonies. The company had barred drivers convicted of murder, sexual assault, kidnapping, and terrorism. But in 22 states, the Times found, the company had approved people convicted of most other crimes, including violent felonies, child abuse, assault, and stalking, so long as the convictions were at least 7 years old. Now, Uber is preparing to change those policies to bar people convicted of violent felonies, sexual offenses, and child or elder abuse and endangerment from driving for Uber, regardless of when those crimes occurred, according to people briefed on the matter. It is unclear when and how the changes will go into effect. The company also is considering changing its policies for other offenses, including harassment, restraining order violations, and weapons charges, which are generally allowed if the convictions are more than 7 years old. Uber declined to specifically comment on the changes. Safety isn't static, and our approach isn't either, an Uber spokesman Matt Coleman said in a statement. We listen, we learn, we speak with experts, and we evolve as the world changes. We believe that's the hallmark of a healthy, effective safety culture. The company has long maintained that it is one of the safest ways to get around, with 99.9% of rides occurring without an incident of any kind. Previously, Uber said the 7-year cutoff for felony convictions strikes the right balance between protecting public safety and giving people with older criminal records a chance to work and rebuild their lives. A series of Times investigations revealed that Uber received a report of sexual assault or sexual misconduct in the United States almost every 8 minutes on average between 2017 and 2022, far more than what the company has publicly disclosed. Uber executives have long been aware of the extensiveness of sexual violence, the Times found, yet they repeatedly prioritized expanding their business over introducing stronger protections, such as automatic video recording. The Times also found that the company allowed many drivers with records of complaints to keep driving until passengers accused them of serious sexual assault. Women who reported being sexually assaulted during Uber rides had said the company's vetting practices put them in harm's way. For example, in 2020, an Uber driver in San Diego with felony convictions for assault with a deadly weapon was reported to the police for using his fingers to forcibly penetrate a passenger's vagina, then choking her and throwing her phone out the window when she tried to fight back. The next year, an Uber driver in Tampa, Florida, with 8 felony convictions, including for robbery with a firearm in 2002, was reported to the police for raping a passenger who had been out celebrating her 21st birthday. And in 2022, an Uber driver in Florida who was on parole after a decade in prison for 2 violent felonies was reported to the police for raping a passenger. The changes to Uber's background check policies come as the company faces scrutiny over its safety record from lawmakers, investors, and others. In California, for instance, a proposed ballot initiative would make ride-hailing companies legally responsible for sexual misconduct and assault against drivers and passengers. This year, in Virginia, lawmakers have introduced a pair of bills with stricter regulations for background checks, among other measures. Drivers were slipping through the cracks, said Lily Franklin, a House delegate who introduced one of the bills after reading the Times investigation. There needs to be reform. Uber has publicly supported both bills. This month, a federal jury in Phoenix ordered Uber to pay $8.5 million to a passenger who said a driver had raped her. Uber argued that it was not responsible for the misconduct of drivers on its platform, whom it classifies as independent contractors, not employees. But the jury rejected that defense, providing a roadmap for more than 3,000 pending sexual assault and sexual misconduct lawsuits that accuse the company of systemic safety failures. Uber, which fended off other claims in the case, including that it was negligent in its safety practices, has plans to appeal the verdict. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Arts panel, packed with Trump allies, approves White House ballroom project. President Trump has eliminated any pocket of resistance from within his administration to his plans for a 90,000-square-foot ballroom. By Luke Broadwater. An arts commission, stacked with President Trump's allies, approved his $400 million ballroom on Thursday, bypassing the normal review process and fast-tracking the vote on a project that would transform the profile of the White House. The vote came even as the panel's longtime secretary, one of the only people involved who was not appointed by Trump, described mass opposition to the project, saying he had received more than 2,000 messages from across the country in 1 week. The Commission on Fine Arts had been expected to hold only a preliminary vote on Thursday, but the panel chose to push forward and give its final approval ahead of schedule. Mr. Trump wants to have the ballroom built and open to guests within a year and a half. This is a facility that is desperately needed for over 150 years, and it's beautiful, said the panel's chairman, Rodney Mims Cook, Jr., whom Mr. Trump appointed to the board this year. The ballroom still needs approval by the National Capital Planning Commission, which the president has also filled with allies, and a federal judge is considering whether to stop the project. But the vote on Thursday cleared at least one logistical hurdle for the ballroom. Thomas Lupka, the panel secretary, who has been in the job for decades, suggested a rushed vote would be highly unusual and tried to slow down the vote, to no avail. The normal process is you would wait for it to come forward with the documentation associated with that, Mr. Lupka said. The normal circumstance would be that you would see it when it was ready. Mr. Lupka also said he was struck by the outpouring of opposition to the project that the commission received. In more than 2 decades of casework here for me, I've never seen as much public engagement on this, he said. We literally have gotten in the past week or so more than 2,000 various messages. He added the summary of it was overwhelmingly in opposition, over 99%, to this project, citizens across the entire spectrum, all professional expertise levels. The general comments were that they were concerned about the illegal demolition without permits or oversight, inappropriate scale that will dwarf the White House, the violation of historic preservation principles, a lack of transparency in funding and contracting, and a fundamental miscarriage of democratic principles. The vote was the latest example of Mr. Trump's elimination of any pocket of resistance from within his administration to his plans for a 90,000-square-foot ballroom, filling the boards and commissions meant to oversee the project with people who work for him. Some of them have no notable background in the arts. Mr. Trump's latest appointee to the Commission of Fine Arts, for instance, is his former receptionist, the 26-year-old Chamberlain Harris, who now works as the Deputy Director of Oval Office Operations at the White House. The Cultural Landscape Foundation, an education and advocacy nonprofit based in Washington, objected to the new makeup of the panel this week. The foundation pointed out that the Commission of Fine Arts was supposed to include experts in relevant disciplines, including art, architecture, landscape architecture, and urban design. But there are no landscape architects on the panel, which the Cultural Landscape Organization says is a monumental deficit, since the commissioners will be making decisions about one of the nation's most important and visible designed landscapes. The White House has defended Mr. Trump's picks and maintained that they were more aligned with the president's America First agenda. President Trump has an incredible eye and appreciation for the arts and only selects the most talented people possible, said Davis Ingle, a White House spokesman. These individuals possess a wealth of experience that reflects the values of everyday Americans and President Trump's vision to make America great again. Mr. Trump said on Wednesday that he planned to have the ballroom built and open to guests within a year and a half. In October, Mr. Trump abruptly tore down one side of the White House, demolishing the entire East Wing, which contained the historical offices of the First Lady. The administration has been under legal pressure from historical preservationists to submit the new ballroom project to a formal review process. So far, the initial construction on the project has been allowed to proceed, though a judge recently expressed deep skepticism about the government's case. Mr. Trump is not the first president to remake the Commission of Fine Arts and appoint members more to his liking. President Harry S. Truman did the same thing after the panel opposed his proposal to add a balcony to the White House in the 1940s. Here's how the president is pushing through his project by remaking the panels that oversee construction in Washington. Replacing the architect. Mr. Trump has faced much criticism that his plans for a White House ballroom are too large and that the building will dwarf the Executive Mansion and the West Wing. The president's first architect on the ballroom project, James C. McCrary II, presented him with several smaller approaches, but Mr. Trump kept pushing for a bigger project. The men disagreed over the ballooning size of the ballroom, and eventually Mr. McCrary agreed to take a step back as the main architect on the project. He was replaced by Shalom Baranis, whose firm has been designing government buildings for decades and has collected awards for its commitment to historic preservation. Mr. Baranis did make one change to his drawings in response to feedback from the Fine Arts panel. He redesigned a planned portico on the building to make it less prominent. Remaking the Commission of Fine Arts. Mr. Trump fired the entire board of the Commission of Fine Arts last year and began appointing replacements this year. Among those appointed was Mr. McCrary, who has recused himself from discussing or voting on the project. Others include Ms. Harris, who works for Mr. Trump as the Deputy Director of Oval Office Operations. Pamela Hughes Patnode, who previously worked for Mr. Trump as the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and Mary Ann Carter, an ally of the White House Chief of Staff who serves as chairwoman of the National Endowment for the Arts. The new chairman of the panel, Mr. Cook, has made clear that he views his job as ensuring that the president's project can go forward. Our president has a very ambitious plan for the District of Columbia, as well as the world, Mr. Cook said at the commission's meeting last month, so we need to let the president do his job and as best we can keep his mind off things like this, that we can keep him rolling and do it as elegantly and beautifully as the American people deserve for generations and further centuries into the future. Mr. Trump praised the board's action on social media on Thursday. The Commission of Fine Arts just approved unanimously 6-0 with one recusal because he had a conflict in that he worked professionally on the job, the White House ballroom, he wrote. Great accolades were paid to the building's beauty and scale. Thank you to the members of the commission. Remaking the National Capital Planning Commission. Mr. Trump has also assumed control of the leadership of the National Capital Planning Commission, though that panel also has representation from the D.C. government. The commission must approve Mr. Trump's plans before he can begin construction. He has installed his former personal lawyer, Will Scharf, as the chairman of this panel. Mr. Scharf currently serves as assistant to the president and the White House staff secretary. He is known for presenting Mr. Trump with executive orders to sign in the Oval Office. Mr. Scharf made no objection when Mr. Trump abruptly tore down the East Wing to make way for the ballroom project. He maintained that his panel has no control over demolition, only new construction. The National Capital Planning Commission has also put the ballroom project on a fast track for final approval at its meeting next month. British police arrest former Prince Andrew in stunning blow to royal family. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, a longtime associate of Jeffrey Epstein, is being investigated on suspicion of misconduct in public office by Megan Specia, Michael D. Shear, and Michael Levinson. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, once regarded as a dashing war hero and the favorite son of Queen Elizabeth II, was arrested by the British police on Thursday amid widening scrutiny over his ties to the disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein. Mr. Mountbatten Windsor's arrest on suspicion of misconduct in public office was a staggering blow to the British monarchy and the latest chapter in his downfall, coming months after his connections to Mr. Epstein led Buckingham Palace to strip him of his royal ties and evict him from his royal residence. The police did not provide any details of the investigation, but the arrest of Mr. Mountbatten Windsor, the younger brother of King Charles III, who was formerly known as Prince Andrew, came after reports suggested that he may have shared confidential information with Mr. Epstein while serving as a British trade envoy, a position he held from 2001 to 2011. The police did not mention the accusations of sexual abuse that have shadowed Mr. Mountbatten Windsor, 66, or the trafficking allegations that Mr. Epstein was facing when he died by suicide in a Manhattan jail in 2019. In a remarkable written statement addressed directly to the British public, Charles said he had learned of his brother's arrest with the deepest concern. What now follows is the full, fair, and proper process by which this issue is investigated in the appropriate manner and by the appropriate authorities, Charles wrote. In this, as I have said before, they have our full and wholehearted support and cooperation. He concluded his statement with a note of determination. Meanwhile, my family and I will continue in our duty and service to you all, Charles wrote. He later attended an event for London Fashion Week, and his wife, Queen Camilla, went to a lunchtime orchestral concert in the city. The arrest was without precedent in modern British history. The last senior member of the royal family to be arrested in connection with a serious crime was King Charles I, who was executed for treason nearly 4 centuries ago, on January 30th, 1649. The arrest of Mr. Mountbatten Windsor, who was released after around 11 hours in custody, escalated the crisis confronting the British Crown amid deepening revelations of his connections to Mr. Epstein and allegations that he sexually abused a young woman trafficked to him by the American. The former prince has denied that he raped the woman, Virginia Roberts Giuffre. A British anti-monarchy group, Republic, said it had reported evidence of potential misconduct in public office to the Thames Valley Police, the police force west of London that is leading the investigation. Gordon Brown, who was the British Prime Minister when Mr. Mountbatten Windsor was a government trade envoy, issued a statement on Thursday saying that he had provided additional information about Mr. Epstein to the Thames Valley Police ahead of Mr. Mountbatten Windsor's arrest. The Thames Valley Police, citing national guidelines, did not identify the man they had arrested, but confirmed that they had taken a man in his 60s from Norfolk into custody at about 8 a.m. and were carrying out searches at addresses in Berkshire and Norfolk. The police were seen in Norfolk on Thursday morning at the Sandringham Estate, the private 20,000-acre country retreat of Charles and Camilla, where Mr. Mountbatten Windsor had been living since he was evicted earlier this year from the Royal Lodge, his residence in Windsor. The police later confirmed that the man they had arrested was released under investigation, a designation that indicated that the investigation was not over. Photos shared by the BBC showed Mr. Mountbatten Windsor in the back seat of a car appearing to leave a police station where he had been held. Under British law, the police generally cannot hold suspects for more than 24 hours without charging them. In the British legal system, the investigation could continue with charges filed at a later date. Mr. Mountbatten Windsor's representatives did not immediately respond to requests for comment. According to the guidance provided to British prosecutors, misconduct in public office is committed when a public officer willfully neglects to perform their duty or willfully misconducts themselves in abuse of the public trust. No case has ever tested whether a member of the royal family could be considered a public officer, but Mr. Mountbatten Windsor, in addition to serving as a government trade envoy, was a helicopter pilot for the Royal Navy during the war with Argentina over the Falkland Islands in 1982. He met Mr. Epstein in the late 1990s through Ghislaine Maxwell, then the financier's girlfriend and the daughter of the British media magnate Robert Maxwell. Mr. Mountbatten Windsor told the BBC in 2019 that the friendship was valuable, partly because of the networking opportunities it offered. Ms. Giuffre had accused Mr. Epstein and Ms. Maxwell of recruiting her for sexual abuse under the guise of becoming a professional masseuse. In 2022, Mr. Mountbatten Windsor paid Ms. Giuffre an undisclosed sum to settle a lawsuit in a New York court that accused him of raping her when she was 17. He did not admit any wrongdoing in the case. Ms. Giuffre died by suicide last year. On Thursday, her family welcomed Mr. Mountbatten Windsor's arrest. At last, the family said, today our broken hearts have been lifted at the news that no one is above the law, not even royalty. That view was echoed by David Lammy, Britain's Deputy Prime Minister and Justice Secretary, who told the BBC that nobody in this country is above the law and that the investigation must happen in the usual way. The arrest underscored a striking contrast in the official responses to the Epstein files, which have tainted the reputations of powerful figures in business, academia, entertainment, and politics. The British authorities have moved aggressively to investigate the possibility of crimes emerging from the documents, while the police in the United States have not. President Trump, discussing the arrest with reporters, said, "I think it's a shame. I think it's very sad. I think it's so bad for the royal family." In Britain, the police are also investigating whether Peter Mandelson, a longtime British political operative who served as ambassador to the United States, committed misconduct in public office by sharing sensitive government documents with Mr. Epstein. He has denied any criminal wrongdoing. The files also revealed that Sarah Ferguson, Mr. Mountbatten Windsor's ex-wife and the one-time Duchess of York, carried on a long and personal correspondence with Mr. Epstein long after he was convicted of soliciting prostitution in 2008. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. In devastated Gaza, grandiose peace plans clash with reality. Israeli strikes on Gaza have killed about 600 people since a ceasefire began, according to health officials in the territory. Many displaced Palestinians are still living in tents. There are some 60 million tons of war debris to be cleared. By Isabel Kirshner, Adam Raskin, Aaron Boxerman, and Nathan Odenheimer. As President Trump prepared for the inaugural gathering of his Board of Peace in Washington on Thursday, there were detailed proposals encompassing hopes and dreams for a gleaming new post-war Gaza. Then there is reality. Trump is trying to make things rosy, but as a matter of fact, the situation is still catastrophic, said Professor Mehmar Abou-Sada, a Palestinian political analyst from Gaza City who was displaced from his home during the Israel-Hamas war and now resides in Cairo. A fragile ceasefire came into force in October, 2 years after the deadly Hamas-led attack on Israel that ignited the war. But the path forward is uncharted, labyrinthine, and strewed with obstacles. The Trump ceasefire plan is struggling to succeed, Professor Abou-Sada said, blaming both Hamas and Israel. Member states of the new international body tasked with rebuilding Gaza have pledged more than $5 billion for humanitarian and reconstruction efforts in the enclave, according to Mr. Trump, but that is only a fraction of what is needed. The United Nations has estimated the cost of rebuilding the territory at more than $50 billion. Countries have also committed thousands of troops and personnel, laying the groundwork for an international stabilization force meant to maintain security, Mr. Trump said. American officials are discussing plans to build a military base for peacekeepers in an Israeli-controlled area of southern Gaza, according to Western diplomats who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to share the information publicly. Slick PowerPoint presentations paint a picture of a futuristic seaside metropolis, but for now, the Israeli military and private contractors are removing unexploded ordnance and rubble from patches of the Israeli-controlled part of Gaza. There are an estimated 60 million tons of war debris to be cleared away. Gaza barely has the basics. Experts have produced a comprehensive paper on waste management, according to internal planning documents viewed by the New York Times. While the war is over, no one would call Gaza safe. Even under the ceasefire, Israeli strikes have killed about 600 Palestinians there, according to local health officials. Their data does not distinguish between combatants and civilians. Israel says its near-daily strikes are retaliation against militants who violated the truce or to eliminate imminent threats, but children are among the dead. In all, 72,000 people have been killed since the start of the war, according to Gaza's health ministry. Israel says thousands of militants were among those killed. Israeli forces now control about half of the coastal territory, where anti-Hamas militias have taken up arms and looted aid. A weakened but resilient Hamas prevails for now in the other half, where most of the population of 2 million is living, many still displaced and in tents. Hamas has pledged to give up the administration of Gaza, but its gunmen are still manning checkpoints, detaining and questioning people, and collecting some fees. Any real progress in Gaza hinges upon the thorniest issues in Mr. Trump's 20-point peace plan, which was endorsed by the UN Security Council. They include disarming Hamas, demilitarizing Gaza, and ensuring a withdrawal of Israeli forces. Hamas is reluctant to part with its weapons. The militants rely on them to control the population, and they are also core to its identity as a fighting force against Israel. After being caught off guard by the Hamas attack on October 7, 2023, which left 1,200 people dead, according to Israeli officials, Israel is deeply skeptical of the group's intentions. For this reason, Israel is still barring the entry into Gaza of many so-called dual-use items, saying they could be used by Hamas for military purposes. The list changes, but now includes wide-diameter steel tent poles, according to several officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss the issue publicly. The severe food shortages of the war have eased, but Western officials and aid workers accuse Israel, which strictly controls the flow of all goods into Gaza, of slow-walking other kinds of assistance. About 80% of the buildings in Gaza were damaged or destroyed during the war, according to the United Nations. But Israel has largely limited or delayed the entry of caravans and temporary homes, despite some harsh winter weather, according to the Shelter Cluster, a group of UN and humanitarian agencies working on housing solutions. About 4,000 emergency temporary housing units are either now available or in the pipeline, according to the United Nations. About 200,000 prefab relief housing units are needed to support displaced families, according to Alexander de Croo, a UN development official who visited Gaza this week. The Israeli military unit that oversees the entry of aid to Gaza, known as Kogat, rejected accusations that Israel was preventing or delaying assistance. The reality is completely opposite, it said in a statement, adding that Israel was meeting its commitment under the ceasefire agreement. The sole border crossing between Gaza and Egypt recently reopened for people on foot after being closed for most of the past 20 months. Only a trickle of Gazans, mainly people seeking medical treatment abroad and their caregivers, or residents returning to the enclave from abroad, have been able to cross it. Making headway is complicated because the main players are reluctant to take risks or make concessions before the other. All the structures are ready, but on the ground nothing has changed because one thing is dependent on another, said Shira Efron, chair of Israel policy at the RAND Corporation, a U.S.-based research institute. Reconstruction and Israeli military withdrawal are contingent on disarmament and the deployment of the International Stabilization Force, she added. After nearly 20 years of dominating Gaza, Hamas has been trying to tighten its hold on the territory rather than giving it up, Ms. Efron said. They are the ones enforcing law and order, she said. Even the seemingly simple challenge of Hamas handing over the civilian rule of Gaza, which they said they'd agreed to do, will be complicated, she said. Hamas will not be eager to forfeit tax revenues, and it is hard to imagine an orderly transition, she said, noting that the group's own governance of Gaza was poor and partial at best. The Board of Peace has appointed a committee of Palestinian technocrats as a transitional government to replace Hamas, but they are still based in Cairo. The committee members are waiting for a safer environment and a loosening of Israeli restrictions on goods that would improve residents' lives and give them some credibility as they begin to operate in the territory, according to officials and people briefed on their thinking. They need to go back with something in their hands to win the hearts and minds of the people of Gaza, Professor Abu Sada said. For now, committee members have been attending governance training workshops run by the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, according to people briefed on their activities. Over it all, the threat looms of a return to war. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, who is facing an election this year, says he will give the ceasefire plan a chance, but if Hamas does not agree to disarm, he says, it will be done the hard way, with a new Israeli military offensive. The Trump administration and mediators have been drafting a phased disarmament deal that would see Hamas surrender all weapons capable of striking Israel, but would allow the group to keep some small arms, at least initially, according to officials and people familiar with the proposal. Mr. Netanyahu appeared to reject that phased approach to disarmament, which prioritizes heavy weapons such as rockets. The weapons that Hamas used during the October 2023 attack were Kalashnikov assault rifles, he said, demanding that the group hand over 60,000 of them. In any case, it's unclear whether Hamas would even agree to this. Nikolai Mladenov, a former UN official who is serving as the Board of Peace High Representative for Gaza, met Hamas's chief negotiator, Khalil El-Haya, in Cairo this month to press the group on disarmament. Mr. El-Haya refused to discuss the issue with him, according to officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity to talk about a sensitive matter. Assault on Sudanese city bore hallmarks of genocide, UN finds. A paramilitary group in Sudan's civil war acted with genocidal intent in a months-long siege of Al-Fashir, according to human rights experts. By Declan Walsh. A brutal 18-month assault by Sudanese paramilitaries on the city of Al-Fashir, culminating in a spree of massacre, torture, and rape in October, bore the hallmarks of genocide, according to a United Nations report published on Thursday. The finding was documented in gruesome detail by human rights experts. It is the first time a UN-mandated body has accused the paramilitaries, known as the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF, of committing acts of genocide. The UN group does not have the authority to make a formal determination of genocide, which can come from bodies like the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court. But the UN report offered fresh evidence of how Al-Fashir, a now deserted city in the western Sudanese region of Darfur, became a symbol of the worst abuses in the country's civil war, which is approaching its fourth year. Although the report did not focus on the role of foreign powers in the war, the accusations of genocide are likely to bring new scrutiny to the United Arab Emirates, which is accused of supplying the RSF with weapons, mercenaries, and other support, especially in Al-Fashir. A spokesman for the RSF did not respond to requests for comment on the UN report. The leader of the RSF, Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan, previously acknowledged some atrocities by his troops during the assault, but there is little evidence that any were investigated, and he has praised the fighters involved as heroes. The Emiratis denied supporting either side. In an email, the Emirati Foreign Ministry expressed deep concern at the findings of the UN report and condemned atrocities by the RSF and Sudan's military. The two sides have been fighting since April 2023 in a calamitous civil war that has created one of the world's greatest ongoing humanitarian crises. Last year, the United States determined that RSF fighters, who are mostly ethnic Arabs, had committed genocide in late 2023 against the non-Arab Masalit group during their assault on Al-Janiniya, a city in western Darfur. The accusations in the UN report suggest a similar pattern of ethnic targeting in Al-Fashir. Last fall, RSF fighters filmed themselves carrying out executions and massacres as they swept through the city, generating global outrage. The UN report released on Thursday confirmed those accounts and framed them as part of a campaign targeting two other non-Arab groups, the Zaghawa and the Fur. Fighters starved, raped, and killed civilians as part of a planned and organized operation to eliminate those groups, the report found. The report found that 3 of the 5 criteria in an international convention known colloquially as the Genocide Convention had been met. The siege of Al-Fashir began in May 2024 as the RSF sought to rout the Sudanese military from its last stronghold in Darfur. It intensified early last summer after the RSF was pushed out of Khartoum, Sudan's capital. RSF fighters encircled the city with a high earthen berm, starving 260,000 people trapped inside. Survivors cited in the UN report recalled intensive drone and artillery bombing and explicit threats to clean the city. The threats focused on the Zaghawa and Fur because men from those groups were fighting with militias that had allied themselves with Sudan's military to defend a garrison in the city. When the RSF finally seized Al-Fashir in late October, Fighters executed fleeing civilians and survivors hid in piles of corpses. Some were blindfolded, bound, and driven away as fighters chanted, "Slave, slave, slave," the report said. A commander identified as Abu Lulu executed detainees in trenches and shot dead a pregnant woman after asking how far she was into her pregnancy, the report said. Survivors said that Abu Lulu had told prisoners that he would kill them like fat autumn locusts as he marched them to Al-Fashir University, one of the biggest execution sites. The RSF said in October that it had arrested Abu Lulu after videos of him brutalizing civilians caused a global outcry, but the paramilitaries provided no evidence that he faced discipline or that he was still in custody, the UN report said. On Thursday, the United States Treasury Department announced sanctions against Abu Lulu, giving his real name is Al-Fatah Abdul Idris Adam, and 2 other RSF commanders accused of atrocities in Al-Fashir. The Treasury also updated an earlier sanctions notice for Al-Ghani Hamdan Dagalo, a younger brother of the RSF leader, to show that he also holds a passport issued by Kenya, which professes to be neutral in the conflict. It also noted that the RSF assault was backed by drones that struck hospitals and mosques, and by foreign mercenaries, although it did not specify who supplied them. The New York Times and other outlets have reported that the United Arab Emirates supplied drones and other weapons used in the siege of Al-Fashir. In 2024, another group of UN investigators backed those findings. In December, the United States Treasury imposed sanctions on a network that it accused of sending Colombian mercenaries to Al-Fashir in support of the RSF, including a former Colombian soldier in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. The Sentry, a Washington-based research and advocacy group, previously published corporate records showing that the mercenaries had been hired by an Emirati businessman who was a business partner of a senior Emirati official. In response to questions about those accusations, the Emirati Foreign Ministry said there was no evidence for baseless claims associating the UAE with violations of international law in Sudan. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the New York Times on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Dueling protests at South Korean ex-leader's sentencing highlight political rift, as a judge reprimanded former President Yoon Suk-yeol for amplifying political tribalism. Demonstrators from warring camps blared slogans outside the courtroom. By Max Kim and Jin Yu Young. The dueling protests outside the Seoul courthouse, where former President Yoon Suk-yeol of South Korea was sentenced to life imprisonment on Thursday, were heavy on bitterness and retributive fervor, familiar sentiments in a country with deep political polarization. The court found Mr. Yoon guilty of leading an insurrection in 2024 when he declared martial law and sent special forces into the National Assembly to arrest his political opponents. The presiding judge said he had pushed South Korean society into an extreme state of conflict between warring political camps. On Thursday, those tensions were on display outside the courthouse, where pro- and anti-Yoon groups blared their respective slogans and calls for Mr. Yoon and his political nemesis, President Lee Jae-myung, to receive the death penalty through loudspeakers. In one camp, hundreds of Yoon supporters gathered in front of a makeshift stage with a screen playing a live broadcast of the trial. Some waved American flags, a symbol commonly used by South Korea's far-right movement. One man stood atop a van wearing a jacket that said MKGA, short for Make Korea Great Again. Mr. Yoon had enthusiastically courted such crowds ever since his impeachment. Several blocks away, a small cluster of anti-Yoon protesters chanted for the death penalty, the punishment that prosecutors had sought for the ex-president. One demonstrator, Choi Jae-sik, said he had spent nearly every weekend over the past year joining rallies calling for a conviction. Martial law threw the country into chaos, said Mr. Choi, a translator. He took away precious time away from my children. Even the death sentence wouldn't be enough, said Kim Mo-gwen, a college student in his 20s. Mr. Yoon himself showed little emotion in court. After his sentence was read aloud, a television camera showed him averting his gaze from the judge. But his supporters and political adversaries were clearly not satisfied with the verdict. Mr. Yoon's lawyers called the sentence political theater, saying in a statement that the judges had ignored the truth and knelt before the political force that wanted to purge its enemy. They also vowed to fight to the end. "It's unbelievable," Kim Suk-min, a Yoon supporter in her 60s, said outside the courthouse as she held a South Korean flag in support of the former president. "I am at a loss for words." On the other side of the political divide, Yoon Chung-rae, the leader of the governing Democratic Party, expressed disappointment that the sentence had fallen short of the death penalty. He described the outcome as a ruling that defied the South Korean public's sense of justice. In our last article today, writing an ancient Egyptian afterlife in 21 feet of scroll. How would a New York Times obituary writer measure up the scribes of the Book of the Dead? He found out at the Brooklyn Museum, by Sam Roberts. What's next? As a New York Times obituary writer, it's a question I've never dared ask. While interviewing prominent people as I craft in-depth profiles in advance of their deaths, I don't want to miss the story. But the answer is, nobody knows for sure. A news obituary is a biography about a life that begins at the end. It mentions death only once. It never suggests what, if anything, follows. A prospect so many people have contemplated for thousands of years, whether what they hope or think comes next is heaven or reincarnation or an oblivion equivalent to the one we were in before we were born. I was reminded of this gap in my reporting by the death in ancient Egypt of a man named Ankh-Morwer more than 2 millenniums ago. There were no newspapers or obituary pages back then, but Ankh-Morwer's death did not go unrecorded. It was memorialized on a rare, intact, gold-accented funerary scroll 21 feet long, known as the Book of the Dead. Those types of books predate the Times obit pages by about 3,000 years. Ankh-Morwer's scroll, gold amulets, reed pens, and other ancient artifacts went on public display last month, perhaps for the first time ever, curators say, in the Brooklyn Museum's Egyptian galleries, for an exhibit titled Unrolling Eternity, The Brooklyn Books of the Dead. The scroll was believed to have been found in Ankh-Morwer's tomb near Memphis in Lower Egypt, early in the 19th century by Henry Abbott, a British doctor. His collection of some 1,200 artifacts was purchased by the New York Historical Society and later transferred to the Brooklyn Museum. For the first time, it is on permanent exhibition there after being stashed away for some 150 years. It has undergone a 3-year restoration by the conservators Ahmed Tarek and Josephine Jenks, thanks to a grant to the museum from the Bank of America. How does the scroll compare to the way we cover deaths today? To begin with, a Book of the Dead is a misnomer applied by 19th century Western scholars. A more accurate translation of the title would be Spells of Coming Forth by Day. Unlike obituaries, they aren't biographies. They aren't even books. And they're not of the dead. They're for the dead. A chapter-by-chapter encyclopedia of self-selected incantations and magic spells from master indexes compiled by Egyptian priests. Ankh-Morwer's includes 162 of them. He thought he knew what was next and came prepared. The rolled-up scroll he took with him, probably in his sarcophagus when he died, is a practical guidebook, a roadmap to the underworld, helping souls avoid the perilous beasts and other dangers in their quest for an idealized eternity, which, for the ancient Egyptians, meant a reunion with the gods in the field of reeds, reserved for righteous souls. We clutch at straws in our own ways. Our obsession with what comes next explains why so many people, knowing that I write obituaries, slip me their resumes and CVs. They're concerned about posterity in the paper of record, about their reputations, about how they will be judged by future generations, a concern that helps distinguish humans from other species. It's why George Washington in Hamilton sings, "You have no control who lives, who dies, who tells your story." It's also a question that has perpetuated religion in one form or another. Even skeptics of divine providence cover their bets. I quoted the columnist Charles Krauthammer in his obituary as saying, "I don't believe in God, but I fear him greatly." In a 1971 book, Woody Allen cracked wise. "I don't believe in an afterlife, although I am bringing a change of underwear." Paid death notices often say that people passed, but at the Times, to avoid euphemisms, only quarterbacks do. Taking for granted that we know where they went. People place in memoriam advertisements addressed to relatives on the anniversaries of their deaths. Disney theme parks' secret staff protocols even include what has been called a white alert code to warn when a guest seeking perpetuity in the Magic Kingdom attempts to scatter human ashes in the park. If one derivation of obituary is the Latin word obire, which suggests a rite of passage, a euphemism if there ever was one, the word still connotes an ending. Whatever happens next, if anything, is left for biographers to assess, clergy to warn against, or spiritualists to invoke in seances. The Book of the Dead represents a beginning of sorts. It's all about the future. The scrolls were typically commissioned and approved by the subjects or their families beforehand, akin to the obituaries of famous people that we prepare in advance, but based on our news judgment, not a commission, and without their approval. While it is generally more prescriptive than descriptive, it may mention the departed's divinely inspired human deeds, but the pre-dead are also prepped to recite in their underworld odyssey what constitutes a negative confession. They must enumerate before a panel of judges the sins they did not commit during their lifetimes. The scroll provides some physical evidence about who Ankh-Morpork was, his age, and how he ranked in society. He wasn't poor. 3 scribes probably spent several months brushing the cursive hieroglyphics on fibrous pith from papyrus plants to produce his scroll, distinguished by its gilded accents and the fact that it was displayed unfurled from beginning to end. His scroll was custom-made. Other fill-in-the-blanks versions could be bought off the rack, with the deceased's name added later. But the scroll reveals little about his background or accomplishments. He might have been too young to have achieved much. He was the son of Tanafreher, who was beautiful of face. Someone of the same name, not necessarily his mother, was a musician and a priestess. We don't learn enough about Ankh-Morpork to know whether he would have merited a Times obituary. The scroll measures 21 feet. That's considerably longer than any article I have ever written, and my Times obits were never gilded. The longest obituary published in the Times was Pope John Paul II's in 2005 by Robert D. McFadden. Its 13,870 words voluminously reviewed his record at the Vatican, of course, but also revealed that he was fluent in 7 languages, was a guitarist, and played goalie on his high school soccer team, and was the first non-Italian pontiff in 455 years. That's a lot more than we know, even now, about Ankh-Morpork. All in all, I'd rather be an obituarist than a stenographic scribe whose Book of the Dead got entombed in a sarcophagus, not to be disinterred for thousands of years, if ever, no matter how artfully crafted or well received by the subject who commissioned it. I'm willing to bet, said Ekaterina Barbash, the Brooklyn Museum's curator of Egyptian classical and ancient Near Eastern art, they didn't expect anyone else to read it. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, February 20th issue of the New York Times. Your reader has been Chris Wilhelm. Thank you for listening.